So we'll begin our discussion with reproduction of plants and animals. So like on the previous discussions or previous meetings, ano na lagi yung plants compared sa animals. Okay, so for the reproduction of flowering plants, bakit flowering plants lang? Always remember that the reproductive part of the plants will always be the flowers. Okay, so hindi pwede mag-reproduce ang stem, pwede rin ang roots, pero ang main reproductive organ ng halaman ay flowers. That's why, kapag binigyan kayo ng jowa ninyo ng flowers, it's not a symbol of love. It's a symbol of reproduction. Yun yung common connotation kapag siya ay sa biology majors. Okay? So for flowers, these are reproductive shoots of the angiosperm sporophyte. So if you recall from your junior high days, we have two generations ng plants. We have the gametophyte and the sporophyte. So I will not be discussing it in detail kasi hindi naman ito botany. Okay, and then these flowers, they attach to a part of the stem called the receptacle. So if you refer to this diagram, you have here yung stem na kalimitan kasi ng misconception sa bio, yung stem na pinagkakabitan ng flower, ang tawag nila ay stem. It should be called receptacle. Okay, so the stem, the point of attachment of the flowers to the shoot system will be called the receptacle. So ito yung receptacle. And then, flowers consist of four floral organs. We have the carpel, stamen, petals, and sepals. So we have the stamen and carpels. These are the main reproductive part of the flowers. Yung stamen ay the male part, and then the carpel will be the female part of the flower. And then for the sepals and petals, these are modified leaves. So yung sepals and petals, they are not just there for aesthetic purposes. Ang sepals and petals also play in pollination. So nakadepende yung mga pollinators kasi like the bees, yung mga butterfly, they prefer certain colors for them to pollinate that specific flower. So we will be discussing that later. So refer to this diagram for the parts of the flower. So you have here the stamen, you have the anther and the filament. Ito yung anther which holds the pollen grains, which is for pollination, of course. And then filament, it attaches the anther dun sa flower. And then we have here the petal. Merong mga flowers, merong 3 petals, merong 5. So depende yan sa species ng flowers. And then for the carpel or for the female part of the flower, we have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So you have here the sepal. Yung dahon, yung parang leaf-like structure sa base ng flower, you call that sepal. It's not a leaf. Okay? And then a carpel has a long style with a sticky stigma on top that captures pollen. So at the base of the style is an ovary containing one or more ovules. So if we go back to the illustration, you have here the stigma, which will capture the pollen grains, and then it will travel to the ovary of the flower using the style, yung neck-like structure. So yung style, when you cut the flower in cross-section, so pag nag-cut kayo ng flower ng cross-sectional, sticky yung ends, para rin siya yung sa female reproductive part na meron ding sticky mucus. Okay, so this is to prevent other molecules or other organisms from coming in. So there are also cases wherein yung style, yung mga carnivorous plants, ginagamit na yung kanilang style to capture their food. Okay? And then, fertilized ovules produce seeds, and most of the time, these seeds turn into fruits. So kapag nag-take kayo ng botany in the future, you will learn na merong iba't ibang klaseng fruit. So example, kapag coconut, hindi siya nut. Okay? Coconut is not a nut kasi siya ay dehiscent fruit. Okay? And then, a single carpel or group of fused carpel is called a pistil. So meron minsan kasi, hindi kasi given na, di ba ito kasi ang common example ng flower would be gumamela. So hindi kasi laging ganyan yung structure ng flower na isa lang yung stigma, isa lang yung style, isa lang yung ovary. So there are some flowers na marami silang carpels, and you call them pistil. Okay? And then, a stamen consists of a filament topped by an anther. An anther contains microsporangia which produces the pollen, yung pollen grains. And then sepals or structures that resemble the leaves, as I have said earlier. So ano ba yung isang function ng sepal is to protect the flower or the floral buds when they are still young. So if you remember, yung kapag nakasara pa yung mga flowers, yung kulay green na part, those are the sepals. They protect the floral buds. And then, of course, petals, they are typically brightly colored to attract the pollinators. So, meron tayong iba't ibang pollinators. It can be abiotic factors. Ano ba yung, when we say abiotic factors, these are the non-living aspect of the environment. And then, kapag naman siya ay biotic, these are the living aspect of the environment. So, pollinators can be abiotic or biotic factors. So, we will be discussing those later. So there are also categories of flowers. We call a flower complete if it contains all four floral organs. Ano ba yung four floral organs? We have the stamen, yung pistil or yung carpel. We also have the sepals and the petals. So if a flower contains all of these four, they are called complete flowers. And then, there are also cases wherein a flower lacks one or more floral organs. It's example, walang petal yung flower. So, there are some flowers na talagang walang petal. We call them apetalous. So, kapag wala yung isang part ng floral organ, like the petal or the stamen, we call them incomplete flowers. Okay, again, kapag complete, all floral organs, we have the stamen, the pistil, and then sepal and petal, when they are present in a flower, we call them complete flowers. And then if the flower lacks one or more floral organs, we call them incomplete flowers. Meron din tinatawag tayong perfect flower at saka imperfect flower. Pag imperfect flower, both sexes are present. Male and female part of the flower is present sa isang flower lang. So those are perfect flowers. And then, pag naman imperfect flowers, only one reproductive organ is present in the flower. It's either male or female reproductive organ. Okay? So, may dito, kapag complete, all four floral organs. Pag incomplete, kapag naman perfect flower, ang pinag-uusapan ay reproductive structure ng flower. Okay? Baka may question so far? And then, another factor would be, always remember that all complete flowers are perfect, but not all perfect flowers are complete. Okay? Always remember, all complete flowers are perfect, but not all perfect flowers are complete. Why is that so? Kasi kapag complete flower, present yung four floral organs. Meaning, kapag present yung four floral organs, automatic, meron siyang male at saka female reproductive organ. That's why, complete flowers will always be perfect flowers. Pero bakit hindi pwede maging complete ang isang perfect flower? Kasi possible na present yung reproductive organs, both reproductive organs ng isang flower, pero possible din na wala siyang petal. So hindi given na perfect flower yung isang flower, complete agad siya. Okay? It might be missing petals or the sepals. But always remember, lahat ng complete flower ay perfect flower. Okay? And then, sterile flowers lack both stamens and carpels, and unisexual flowers lack one or the other. So, meron kayong minsan, kung kayo mga plantito or plantita, minsan may makikita kayo dyan na yung sa isang receptacle, madaming flowers. So, kapag sa isang receptacle, it is composed of two or more flowers, we call them inflorescence. Okay, clusters of flowers in one receptacle are called inflorescence. And then we have different methods of pollination. So, in angiosperms, pollination is the transfer of pollen from anther to stigma. It can occur by wind, water, animals, as I have said earlier. Pwede siyang biotic or abiotic. And then wind-pollinated species like grasses and many trees release large amounts of pollens. Kaya di ba minsan sa Nara, kapag yung summer na, Ayan, kapag dry season na nangyayari diyan, yung nalalaglag na yung mga bulaklak ng Nara. Yun ay isang sign din po ng pollination. And then most angiosperm species depend on animal pollinators to transfer pollen directly between flowers. So ano ba yung different agents of pollination? We have pollination by wind, and then we have pollination by bees. We also have moths and butterfly, bats, flies, and by birds. So ito yung mga common agents of pollination. So we discuss them one by one. For pollination of bees, most of the time, the flowers pollinated by bees are brightly colored and have a sweet fragrance. So if you have been to a bee farm, kalimitan ng mga flowers doon, mga orange, mga yellows, most of them are brightly colored. And then, these flowers, they have nectar guides, which are ultraviolet markings that direct bees and other insects to the nectar producing glands. So sa bees naman, hindi kasi kagaya ng ibang pollinators na merong season ang bees sa pag-pollinate. So, ang bees pollinate flowers year-round. That's why, kapag halimbawa, di ba yung mga flowers may season? So, if you will be buying honey from a bee farm, magkakaiba yung lasa ng honey kapag siya ay month of January to March. Maiba rin yung lasa ng honey ng April to June kasi magkakaibang flowers yung present unless yung bee farm ay isang kind lang ng flower or yung flowers nila ay same all throughout the year. Pero in the case of farms na yung malalawak na farms na may iba-ibang flowers, iba-iba rin yung lasa ng kanilang honey. Okay, hindi lalo na kapag pollinated by bees, hindi nagkakaparehas yung honey ng iba't ibang harvest. Kalimitan magkakaiba sila ng lasa. Okay? Kasi magkakaiba yung flowers. Magkakaiba rin yung lasa ng nectars. And then, when we say, pag naman pollination by moth and butterfly, the difference between the bees, kapag dito, butterfly pollinated flowers, they are brightly colored. So, if you study botany in the future, ito yung kalimitan blue at saka violet kapag butterfly pollinated flowers. And then, kapag moth pollinated flowers, these are usually white or yellow. So, ano ba yung difference between moth and butterfly? Kapag nakadapo, tapos nakabuka yung pakpak, moth yung tawag sa kanya. Pero pag nakasara yung pakpak niya, butterfly. So, yung mariposa na sinasabi ng mga tao na butterfly, those are not butterflies. Mariposas are moths. Pollination by bats. So, yung bat-pollinated flowers naman are light-colored and aromatic. So, bakit siya aromatic? Kasi, mas matimbang yung aromatic flowers sa bats kasi wala naman silang eyes or wala silang supersonic eyes to distinguish yung brightly colored from light-colored flowers. That's why they rely on the aroma of the flowers. So, ito yung example ng yung flowers na pinopollinate ng bats. Okay? And then we have pollination by flies. So, many fly-pollinated flowers look and smell like rotten meat. Kaya saan ba lumalapit yung mga flies? Siyempre, sa mga ganyan yung amoy. So, ano ba example ng pinopollinate ng flies? Yung Rafflesia. So, pollinated by flies kasi hindi ganun kaganda yung amoy ng Rafflesia. Okay. And then for pollination by birds, bird-pollinated flowers are usually large and bright red or yellow, have little odor, and produce large quantities of nectar. So the petals of bird-pollinated flowers are often fused into a floral tube. So if you will look at this structure, if you will look at this illustration, kalimitan ng mga pinapollinate ng birds would be yung long tube flowers. Kasi 'di ba may beaks yung birds, that's why nag-a-adapt yung mga flower species dun sa mga pollinators nila. So example, kapag bees kalimitan ang kanilang flowers yung walang long tube kagaya ng sa birds kasi in the first place wala namang beak yung bees. And then kapag naman sa bats, kalimitan ang adaptation ng flowers na pinopollinate nila upside down. Kasi di ba yung mga bats, they prefer yung upside down sila. So in terms of the birds, yung flowers na pinopollinate ng birds, marami dyan ay long tube flowers para dun sa mga beaks ng birds. So for the mechanisms of asexual reproduction, we in plants common dyan yung process of fragmentation. So when we say fragmentation, this is the separation of a parent plant into parts that develop into whole plants. In other words, yung fragmentation, if you're familiar with stem cutting, so common siya, it is a mode of asexual reproduction for the plants. So recall lang, ano ba yung asexual reproduction? When we say asexual reproduction, this does not involve any sex cells or gametes. So walang egg cell, walang sperm cell. So pagka asexual reproduction, most likely ay yung mga other parts of the plant, vegetative parts, yung mga stem, yung mga leaves. So yan lang yung involved sa asexual reproduction. So in terms of yung mga roses, pwede silang mag-reproduce through asexual reproduction by stem cutting. So i-cut nyo lang yung stem ng tama, i-plant nyo lang yung plant, and then tutubo na siya into a new organism. So that's the mode of reproduction mostly ng plants. And then in other species, a parent plant's root system gives rise to adventitious shoots. Ano ba yung sinasabing adventitious shoots or adventitious roots? Pag yung adventitious roots, these are yung hair-like structures or yung roots na nasa shoot, nakalagay sa stem. So ano ba example ng adventitious roots? Ito yung, if you're familiar with kalabasa, yung sa squash. Yung sa squash kasi meron silang parang mga root-like structure sa stems nila. We call them adventitious roots. Okay? And then when you plant them, 'di ba may mga halaman na quote and quote gumagapang, tapos they tend to produce a new organism or a new plant. So ito po ay brought about by adventitious roots. Okay, or adventitious shoots. And then, ano ba yung advantage and disadvantage of asexual and sexual reproduction? So for asexual reproduction, since siya ay mga stem cutting, fragmentation, technically, the offsprings produced by asexual reproduction would be genetically identical. As I have said in our previous discussions, kapag genetically identical yung mga offspring, possible na hindi sila makasurvive ng evolution. Okay, kasi di ba sa evolution, survival of the fittest. That's why for organisms na genetically identical with the parents, possible that they cannot withstand the drought or yung mga catastrophes. And then, asexually reproducing plants that require pollinators or nearby individuals of the same species to produce offspring. Kasi sa asexual reproduction naman, hindi naman kailangan yung pollen grains at saka yung fertilization. Okay? And then, somehow, yung identical species would also be beneficial in a stable environment. However, kapag paiba-iba yung environment, like yung effects ng climate change, possible na hindi rin mag-survive yung genetically identical na offsprings. And then, for asexual reproduction, it is also called vegetative reproduction, because the progeny arise from mature vegetative fragments. When we say vegetative fragments, these are the parts of the plant na hindi flower or hindi reproductive organ. And then, these progeny are more resilient than the seedlings produced by sexual reproduction. Okay. So the lack of genetic, as I have said earlier, the lack of genetic variation among asexually producing plants makes them vulnerable to local extinction if there is an environmental change. Kaya kalimitan nagsasuffer ngayon sa climate change ay yung mga farms nagpa-produce ng flowers or even yung mga even agricultural lands, yung mga crop, may nagka-crop rotation, ganyan. Because of the effects ng climate change, yung iba kasing plants ay hindi nakaka-adapt agad. Okay, that's why ngayon nauuso yung mga drought-resistant crops or yung mga flood-resistant crops. Nauuso sila because of the change in the environmental status. And then, some flowers can self-fertilize to ensure that every ovule will develop into a seed. However, when we say selfing, ito yung self-fertilization, it reduces genetic diversity among offspring. Aside from that, many species have evolved mechanisms to prevent selfing. One of those mechanisms would be the dioecious species. So pagka siya ay dioecious, yung isang plant, meron lang siyang isang reproductive organ. It's either the staminate and or the carpellate. Okay, so isang tree, pwedeng lahat sila ay male part lang, yung isa namang tree, lahat sila ay female. So ito yung isang example or isang adaptation ng plants to prevent self-fertilization. And then another example ng adaptation ng plants ay monoecious naman. So yung monoecious, hindi siya prevent ng self-fertilization. Why? Because monoecious species have the carpellate and the staminate flowers all in one plant. Kapag dioecious, separate po ang staminate at saka carpellate. Kapag naman siya monoecious, nasa iisang plant lang yung staminate at saka carpellate flowers. Okay? And then, yung ibang species na monoecious, so hindi lang siya yung ibang species na monoecious species, some of them, they also tend to prevent self-fertilization by arranging the flowers randomly. So, pwede magkalayo yung male at saka yung female to prevent self-fertilization. Okay, and then the most common mechanism is self-incompatibility, which is the plant's ability to reject its own pollen. Kaya di ba kalimitan ng mga mahogany trees, yung mahogany trees cannot self-fertilize kasi yung flowers ng individual can be, kapag nag-fertilize siya with the same individual, it can be poisonous for them. That's why yung mahogany, they rely on wind to pollinate or for them to produce new offspring. Okay, yun yung sa self-incompatibility. And then, of course, we always have the debate over plant biotechnology and genetic engineering. Kasi lately, nauso na yung mga GMOs. When we say GMOs, these are the genetically modified organisms. So, plant biotechnology has two meanings. One would be an innovation in the use of plants to make useful products. So, example, if you have heard yung mga BT corn, ito yung mga GMOs ng plants. And then, in a specific sense, when we say genetically modified plants or plant biotechnology, it refers to the use of genetically modified organism in agriculture or industry. Ito yung sinasabi ko ng mga drought-resistant crops, flood-resistant crops. Ito yung mga GMO for agriculture and industry. And then, in plant biotechnology, meron dyan lagi na term which is what we call transgenic. When we say transgenic organisms, these are organisms that have been engineered to express a gene from another species. And then isang reason isang solution to reduce world hunger and malnutrition is through the use of genetically modified plants. So, itong GMOs or GM plants may increase the quality and quantity of the food worldwide. Some transgenic crops have been developed to produce the Bt toxin, which is toxic to insect pests but not vertebrates. That's why, hanggang ngayon kasi under debate pa rin yung paggamit ng Bt corn or yung golden rice. Kasi itong mga to, yung Bt corn at saka golden rice, they tend to deliver more vitamin A and vitamin B for the consumer. Okay? So, ito yung example ng, when we say maize, or yung Seiya maize, diba? Ito yung corn. Okay? So, yung isang example ng non-genetically modified corn, as you can see, consumed by pest yung kanyang mga, ang tawag din, yung kernel ba yun? And then, yung BT maize naman, almost perfect yung appearance niya kasi toxic siya for the pest. Yung gene na BT gene. Okay? And then, of course, itong BT corn na to, they provide a surplus of vitamin A. And then, we also have golden rice. Vitamin B pala yung sa BT corn. And then, sa golden rice naman is vitamin A, which is mostly deficient among the world's poor. And then, transgenic cassava, have increased levels of iron and beta-carotene and reduced cyanide-producing chemicals. Remember, yung cyanide-producing chemicals are harmful for not only for the humans but also for the environment. So yung transgenic crop na ito, they produce high levels of iron and beta-carotene. Always remember na kung magpo-produce man sila ng high levels of those chemicals or high levels of those substances, when we consume them, kung ano lang yung kailangan ng ating body, yun lang ang ating i-absorb. And then the rest would be flushed out through our excretory system or yung ating digestive system. So, kagaya ng example ko last week, napagka high levels of iron, kapag nag-consume kayo ng high levels of iron tapos hindi na-absorb lahat ng katawan, ang feedback mechanism niya would be yung inyong urine ay yellowish, sobrang yellowish niya, or possible na amoy kalawang yung urine. So, yun yung isang manifestation kung paano na e-excrete ng katawan yung excessive levels ng iba't ibang substances. Biofuels, of course, isang advantage of using transgenic crops would be the use of biofuels. So when we say biofuels, these are fuels derived from living biomass and the total mass of organic matter in a group of organisms in a particular habitat. Kalimitan ng mga thesis ng grade 12, kasi kayo hindi kayo pwede mag-lab eh. Isang common topic sa grade 12 would be development ng biofuels. So example, yung instead of di ba yung mga fuels natin ngayon are called fossil fuels, yung ginagamit sa mga gasolinahan. Kasi they are the remains of plants and animals from millions of years ago. Pero ito kasi mga fossil fuels, they are non-renewable resources. Or pwede silang renewable. However, it will take a lot of time before we can form the fossil fuels. Kasi before a remain of an organism will be considered as a fossil fuel, kailangan millions of years na siyang nakabaon doon sa landmass. Okay, so yung ginagamit yung mga diesel, yung mga gas ngayon, mga kerosene, those are remains of plants and animals from millions of years ago. Okay? So yung biofuels na dinedevelop ng mga researchers lately, these are derived from pwedeng yung mga peels ng fruits, pwedeng yung mga seeds, or pwedeng other parts ng plants na commonly tinatapon sila ng mga tao pero pwede pala siyang gawin sa biofuels. So one of the best examples ng biofuels would be orange peels, even mango peels. They are very good sources of biofuels. So these biofuels will not only be beneficial for the consumers kasi siya ay cost efficient, but also it will help the environment. Yung release ng carbon dioxide will be lessened through the use of biofuel. Okay, so for animal reproduction, it can take many forms. So sabi ko nga kanina, since sobrang lawak ng animal kingdom, there are variations on how animals reproduce. So there are some organisms that they reproduce without any form of gametes or yung sexual intercourse. So hindi lahat ng animals require sexual intercourse in order for them to produce offsprings. And then there are also some animals that they can change their sex. Pwede silang at one season pwede silang male, and then there are also some season na pwede silang female part. Okay? And then there are also some organisms that they can produce both sex cells, pwedeng yung male or female gamete. Depende sa species and depende sa kanilang capabilities. So in certain corals, individuals have both male and female organs. We call them most of the time hermaphrodites. And the population outlives its members only by reproduction and the generation of new individuals from existing ones. Always remember na ang main goal of animals is to reproduce. Kasi without reproduction, hindi magkakaroon ng continuity ng isang particular species. Without reproduction, hindi rin magkakaroon ng evolution. So most of the time, animals, when they cannot reproduce, they die in the animal kingdom. Like the plant kingdom, meron din tayong sexual at saka asexual reproduction. When we say sexual reproduction, this is the creation of an offspring by fusion of haploid gametes, yung male sperm and female eggs to form a diploid zygote. And then in animals also, we also have a sexual reproduction for less complex forms of animals, which is the creation of offspring without the fusion of egg and sperm. So pwedeng fragmentation, pwedeng regeneration. So you just recall yung iba't ibang forms ng asexual reproduction sa animals from your junior high bio. So yung ano ba yung mechanisms of asexual reproduction among animals? So budding is a simple form of asexual reproduction found only among invertebrates. When we say budding, ito po yung new individuals arise from outgrowths of existing ones. So ano mga example ng merong budding would be yung sponges, even cnidarians, they reproduce through budding. And then many invertebrates reproduce asexually by fission, which is the separation of a parent into two or more individuals of about the same size. And then another example of asexual reproduction would be fragmentation. So kagaya sa plants kanina, ang animals also reproduce through fragmentation and parthenogenesis. So na may example ng mga to, alam niyo yung sa starfish, kapag sa starfish or yung mga ating mga sea stars, yung limbs ng starfish, once you cut the part ng limbs ng starfish, then they can regenerate it, and then yung na-cut nyo na part will also grow into a new starfish. Yun yung example ng parthenogenesis or fragmentation among animals. And then, for sexual reproduction naman, there are cases wherein a sexually producing animal will find a partner for reproduction. Yung iba na animals, they can, when we say hermaphrodites, these are individuals that have both male and female reproductive system. You might be asking me, ano yung tawag sa mga tao na yung humans na merong dalawang sex organs? They are not hermaphrodites. Okay? For those people na merong dalawang sex organs, merong both male and female, you call them intersex. Okay? And yung dalawang genitals na yun, hindi sila parehong gumagana. One reproductive organ is dominant over the other. Although, meron siyang parehong genitals, yung male and female genitals, only one of them is working. It's either mas dominant yung male or mas dominant yung female. But it cannot produce the two gametes at the same time. And then any two individuals can mate under this system, and in some species, hermaphrodites can also self-fertilize. Ang common ng hermaphrodites sa mga isda. So example, ang tilapia, some species of tilapia will be hermaphrodites. And then several organisms can change their sex under different circumstances. So, as I have said earlier, there are some seasons na yung mga isda, possible silang mag-produce ng male gametes, and then there are also some cases wherein pwede mag-produce naman sila ng female gametes. Depende po yan sa species ng fish. Okay? And then, fertilization depends on mechanisms that bring together sperm and eggs of the same species. When we say fertilization, this is the union of egg and sperm and can be external or internal. For in external fertilization, from the name itself, external, yung eggs at saka yung sperm, they will meet or they will fertilize each other in an external environment. And then, ang isang requirement lang ng external fertilization would be a moist habitat. So the moist habitat is always required for external fertilization to allow the sperm to swim to the egg and to prevent the gametes from drying out. So again, kapag external fertilization, yung eggs will be shed by the female and then it will be fertilized by the sperm in an external environment. Ang example po nito ay sa frogs. Okay, so yung female frog release the eggs doon sa pond or sa moist habitat. And then yung males, mag-release sila ng sperm in order for the sperm to fertilize yung egg. Okay? And then, there are some species also that exhibit spawning in which individuals cluster in the same area to release their gametes into the water at the same time. And in some cases, chemical signals trigger spawning, others environmental cues are responsible. And then we say internal fertilization. This is where it enables the sperm to reach an egg despite a dry external environment. Kasi ito na yung meron ng intercourse yung individuals or yung species. So common siya sa vertebrates, and also ang requirement ng internal fertilization would be copulatory organs. So in terms of humans, ito yung sa penis at saka sa vagina, yung copulatory organs. And then mating animals may make use of pheromones or chemicals released by one organism influence the physiology and behavior of individuals of the same species. And then, ensuring the survival of the offspring, ang internal fertilization will be producing fewer gametes, but the survival of the zygote or the fertilized egg would be higher. Kasi if you will observe dun sa mga lesser complex organisms like yung frogs, marami silang eggs, marami silang zygote, pero possible na let's say 30% or 50% lang yung nagsusurvive na offspring. However, kapag internal fertilization, kokonti lang yung offspring or kokonti lang yung gametes, pero sure yung survival. Kumbaga, mas mataas yung rate ng survival ng offspring. And then, ito yung iba't ibang characteristics kapag internal fertilization. For example, for birds and other reptiles, they have shells and internal membranes to protect the zygote. And then, these protect against water loss and physical damage as the embryos develop. And some animals retain the embryo which develop inside the female. So in the case of mammals, particularly humans, so merong nourishment yung fertilized egg kapag nasa loob siya ng female. And then in many animals, parental care helps ensure survival of offspring. That's why dun sa mga aso, di ba pagka nanganak yung aso, kalimitan defensive masyado yung mother aso, parang ganun. Kasi she wants to ensure the survival of the puppies. Okay? Yun yung reason kung bakit medyo aggressive. Kahit yung cats, when they produce or when they produce the offspring, ayan, aggressive sila. Okay? And then, this is for Anathy, I think. Pero in most species, individuals have gonads, particularly the higher, the more complex organisms, we have gonads in order to produce gametes. And then some organisms do not have gonads, but gametes form from undifferentiated tissues. And then most insects have separate sexes with complex reproductive system. In many insects, the female has a spermatheca in which sperm is stored during copulation. And then, a cloaca is a common opening between the external environment and the digestive, excretory, and reproductive system. So, unlike humans, na magkaiba po ang entry point ng reproductive system at saka ng digestive system, in most insects or in most less complex organisms, meron tayong cloaca, which is the entry point or ito yung point wherein the reproductive, digestive, and excretory organs meet. And then a cloaca is common in non-mammalian vertebrates. Mammals usually have a separate opening in the digestive tract. Okay, and then when we say monogamy, it is relatively rare among animals. When we say monogamy kasi, ito yung isa lang yung partner nung individual. Okay? Most of the animals, they are polygamous. Kahit nga sa tao, meron pa rin polygamous. So, yung monogamy is not really observed among animals. Even humans, kasi common yan. And then, females can sometimes influence the relative reproductive success of their mates. Kasi kalimitan, particularly sa humans, ang males kasi, kaya na mag-reproduce or mag-produce ng sperm cell kahit old age, kahit 100 years old, kaya na mag-produce ng sperm cell. However, yung females kasi ang may limitation. So, ang females kasi, kung gano'n kayo katanda, gano'n rin katanda ang inyong egg cells. And there are some cases wherein this egg, there is a time wherein these egg cells will deteriorate yung kanilang quality. Okay? Kaya kumbaga females na yung deciding factor if that specific species will progress throughout their lifespan. Kasi possible na merong limitation yung females. Okay? So that will be the end of our discussion for the animal reproduction.